My wife's a cold person, Johnny.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, her side of the waterbed is frozen. I never got love when I was a kid either.
No.
My brother got the love. Because he was much neater than I was. My room was messed up, but I didn't care. My brother's room was in order. His towel was lined up neatly, combs, brushes, hair lotions all in the right place. So what did it mean? What is he today? He's an attendant in a men's room. It didn't mean that. It's embarrassing having a brother works in a men's room. People say, hey, Rodney, what kind of work your brother do? I don't know what to say. I tell him he's a business for himself.
Yeah, that's good.
And I say, yeah, what kind of business? A big business? Well, I'll put it this way. If you closed up tomorrow, a lot of people would suffer.
That's true. That's true.
But the whole thing is, you want to be happy, do the work you like. That's what you're going to do, the work you like. Yeah. That's important. Do the work you like. And my friend, the doctor, Dr. Vinny Boombach.
Yeah, how is he? How is the doctor?
The most important thing is never take your work home with you. A lot of guys, they take their work home with them.
Right.
There's a guy in my neighborhood, a traffic cop for 20 years, Johnny. Can't forget he's a traffic cop. Takes his work home with him. It's ridiculous. Makes love to his wife. He tells her to pull over.
Yeah, that's bad. That's bad. I see what you mean.
It's very bad.
Good morning. It is Tuesday, February the 28th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have mark-kaye, No Free Lunch, Hugh Hewitt, and Scott Adams. All that and more when I get back. And now a little bit of mark-kaye.
It's not Donald Trump's fault. Jennifer Ahamade, who is the NTSB chairwoman, she said this to Jake Tapper on CNN.
For this investigation and for this derailment, ECP brakes would not have prevented the derailment. The wheel bearing failed on car number 23. So even with ECP brakes, the derailment would have occurred, the fire would have ensued, and the 5 vinyl chloride tank cars would still have to be vented and burned.
Now, of course, this is really troublesome because you've got the Biden administration, who we basically tell you is chock full of liars. These are CYA types. These are the people that go to Washington, D.C., have no clue what they're doing, and when they screw it all up, they just say and do whatever they can to cover their butts. And most of the time, that involves blaming Donald Trump. But it's really weird because you have Pete Buttigieg saying one thing about these brakes and blaming Donald Trump's regulations or deregulations for it, and then you've got Jennifer Ahamade saying, no, Donald Trump's deregulations had nothing to do with this. So all of a sudden, it's like a mind explosion. Which part of the Joe Biden administration do you believe? Because clearly now we have proof that one of them's lying. We just don't know which one it is. I tend to side with the one that went on CNN. And this is an interesting position for CNN. CNN they have what I think is a unique marketing opportunity here. For years, everybody just discounted them as CNN, the Clinton News Network, the Communist News Network, CNN, misinformation. What Donald Trump, fake news is what he called them.
You are fake news.
That's what everybody knows. CNN is the propaganda arm of the Biden administration. But more so, it seems like they are almost the barometer of BS for the Biden administration. For example, this Pete Buttigieg clip, CNN reported that they had Jennifer Ahamade on, and she said, no, Pete Buttigieg is lying. And I immediately thought to myself, well, Pete Buttigieg must be lying, because CNN would never cross Joe Biden unless it were just inarguably true. They would toe the company line. CNN would listen to the communications department. They would listen to Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg. They would listen to Jen Psaki or Karine Jean-Pierre or whoever their hired hand is, and they would just verbatim report whatever it is the administration told them to report. Well, now they're conflicted, and they chose to say it's not true that this was Donald Trump's fault. It's not true that this brake system would have failed. And the fact that CNN reported that negative information about Pete Buttigieg lends me to believe that that is the actual truth of the matter.
And that was a little bit of mark-kaye, about 2 minutes worth of mark-kaye on the situation in, I guess it's called East Palestine, Ohio. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
If time is money, then interest rates are the price of time. John Malden. What a simple but eloquent way to understand what interest rates are and why they exist. Our money has a purpose now. To part with our money, either because of lending it out for someone else's use or investing it in the equity reward of a business or project, means a delay in that purpose. The interest rate is the price we set on the time we will be parted from our money.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Hugh Hewitt with Senator Tom Cotton about the Wuhan lab leak.
Hugh Hewitt, time to talk about the Wuhan lab leak, and reprising the role of Senator Tom Cotton in January of 2020 is Senator Tom Cotton. He's back, saying the same thing he said 2.5 years ago. Senator Cotton, good morning. How's it feel to be absolutely right and have to have Democrats admit it to you?
Well, Hugh, I knew I was right all along, as did most normal Americans who just looked at the facts in front of their face and used their common sense and said this virus almost certainly came from those labs in Wuhan. You won't be surprised here. I haven't heard many Democrats come up to me in the Senate yet to apologize for saying I and so many Americans were spreading fringe conspiracy theories, or we were racist or nativist or xenophobic. Unfortunately, I don't see many actions from the Biden administration or the Democrats either on trying to make China pay for its wrongdoing. That's really the most important thing. It's not that I was right 3 years ago. It's that I remain right about trying to force China to pay for the millions of lives lost to this virus, the businesses that were destroyed, the jobs that were lost as well, by doing things like revoking its most favored nation trading status, banning Communist Party aligned Chinese nationals from buying our farmland, banning TikTok from our country, and many other steps are long overdue.
Let me play for you Stephen Colbert last night on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert talking about the Department of Energy study, that intelligence report that matches up with the FBI conclusion that the Wuhan lab is where the virus came from. Here is Colbert last night.
But Tom, if you're watching, thank you. Talk to me, Goose. Now, here's another surprising development this weekend. The Department of Energy released a new report saying a lab leak is the most likely origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, there it is. Chinese wet markets, you're off the hook. Let's order a round of pangolin poppers for the table. I love a nice plate of wet apps. Now, if you're can we get some civet fingers, please? Now, if, like me, you're wondering why the Department of Energy is the one making this judgment, it's because that agency oversees a network of U.S. national laboratories, some of which conduct advanced biological research. No. Bad energy department. No biolabs until you finish building your electric car charging stations. Stay in your lane. You don't see the Census Bureau building nukes. But whatever. Who am I to say? They're the energy department. I'm sure they're smart. They wouldn't release these findings unless they were absolutely confident. What's that? They made their judgment with low confidence.
All right, yeah. Senator Cotton, you get it, right? What media is doing now is attacking the finding.
Yeah, well, from that clip, you conclude why I and almost every other American don't watch that show, because it's not very funny. And I say that it's no laughing matter, if you lost your grandmother and didn't have a chance to visit her as she was passing away in the hospital and didn't have a chance to have a funeral service for her. It's no laughing matter if Tony Fauci shut down your business and cost you your job, all of the result of Chinese wrongdoing and duplicity from the very beginning that made this pandemic worse and the effects of it longer than it had to be. So people like Stephen Colbert and the Washington Post and the New York Times and Tony Fauci can try to sweep this all under the rug or make light of it now. But there were severe harms inflicted on the American people. And it's just a reminder of how the left in America, whether it's in media or supposed comedy shows or the White House or social media, tries to suppress honest debate about genuine questions of public concern. Remember, people who said, like, well, gosh, maybe we should study the lab that's right down the street from this so-called food market that doesn't have any bats present, where in the lab they do have bats. And they study coronaviruses. Everybody knows that Chinese labs are very unsound. If you said that, you were accused of spreading fringe conspiracy theories, and you were suppressed on social media accounts, and the media came down on you like a ton of bricks. That's not the way to get to the truth in public debates. It's not the way to make sound public policy. And those same people are doing the exact same things today on a number of issues.
Your colleague, Senator Cruz, has said we've really got to have hearings on everything that went wrong during COVID. But Hewitt's law holds, and this applies to California's drought. It applies to lockdown decisions. Hewitt law is that no administrative agency declares a problem, much less a crisis, solved when such declaration will reduce its authority, budget, or profile. I don't think we'll ever get CDC, NIH, Tony Fauci, anybody to admit they were completely wrong on anything, Senator Cotton. I have no hope of that ever happening. Do you?
Not really, Hugh. I mean, if you look at Tony Fauci's very rigid ideological pronouncements, and in retrospect, even when they do say that something didn't have much effect, like mask wearing, even when you're outdoors, or the vaccines that we all hoped would be more effective than they were, but turned out not to be as effective for stopping the spread of the virus, as opposed to, say, minimizing its harms on those who are most susceptible to it. They still say that they were right at the time. They were just, quote unquote, following the science. When in reality, they were following your iron law, which is taking actions that aggrandized their own power, gave them more control, and gave them more budgets. Reminded of what Kevin Haslam, who was on President Trump's economic team, said about an early meeting in the White House whenever he was portraying the data about how Tony Fauci's desired endless shutdowns and lockdowns could have such a devastating impact on our economy. And Tony Fauci jumped in and said, I'm still in charge, right? That's what it was ultimately about.
The funny thing about it is, and it's not funny, nuance has become impossible. And you just gave a very nuanced answer. I am double vaxxed and I get my boosters because I'm over 65, and it works for seniors. And if we had limited to that, protect the vulnerable, and that would be seniors and people with underlying conditions, it would have been fine. But I'm very sympathetic to people who made early mistakes. So you got to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And they did, but they didn't react, Senator Cotton. They did not change their point of view on anything. Masks, lockdown. Go ahead.
No, they still haven't, and then you see it around the nation's capital. You still have people wearing masks, like when they're walking down the street or when they're riding a car by themselves. For many of these liberals, it's become a kind of political identity. But I do want to stress again just how much harm China inflicted on the civilized world. It's hard to imagine this kind of virus breaking out from, say, I don't know, Denmark or the Netherlands. Because they have much higher safety standards. But let's say it did happen in that kind of country, friendly, democratic, capitalist country, and they had immediately been transparent about what had happened, as early as, late November of 2019. By the time that virus got to our shores in large numbers, in February or March of 2020, we could have already realized that it was most dangerous for people who were elderly and infirm. We might have avoided the extended lockdowns. And like you, Hugh, I don't fault President Trump or any governor or other executive official at any level for taking early precautions against this virus when we didn't know what its reproduction rate was going to be. We didn't know how deadly it was going to be for the general population. But as we quickly learned in March and into April that it was mostly dangerous for the elderly and infirm, we should have taken very rapid action to try to get back to normal as quickly as we could. If China had been transparent from the very beginning, we might have known all that before it arrived on our shores in large numbers and have avoided the worst of the economic losses, the worst of the educational losses for our kids. That's why China still has a lot to answer for, and I just don't see the commitment from the Biden administration in making it answer.
There is a naivete, Senator Cotton, among younger people, not you, but among younger people generally, about what communist regimes are capable of. Now, Gary Oldman in the new series on Apple, Slow Horses, is confusing the daylights out of people because they don't understand what the KGB was. But if they did, they would understand that the communist parties of both countries are capable of anything. And I still believe, and I talked about it with your friend Mike Pompeo yesterday, the possibility that China, having realized what it had done to itself with this virus, just decided that the rest of the world would have to suffer the same consequences so they would not fall behind. And Secretary Pompeo, of course, said, well, we don't have any proof of that, and we never will, but it is plausible if you understand communist regimes. Agree or disagree?
No, I wouldn't say it's plausible, Hugh. It's probable that China understood what this virus could do, and they kept it from the world. They didn't stop travel out of Wuhan to the rest of the world. If they were going to suffer significant numbers of deaths, and certainly if they were going to suffer the kind of economic harms this virus inflicted on Wuhan from the very beginning, when they were locking down entire populations larger than the state of California in January of 2020, then they were going to take the rest of the world along with them on the ride. That's what communists do. And you're right that young people today should have mandatory courses where they have to read things like 1984 and Darkness at Noon and study the history of Soviet Russia or Mao's crimes against his own people, so they understand what communists are capable of.
That's what communists do. I don't know that I've heard anyone in legacy media make that statement in a long time, Senator Cotton. It's as though it's erased from their memory banks how communists act. And Xi is a communist. He's a survivor. He's a ruthless guy. And I don't think the world gets it.
Well, it's not just in liberal media. I mean, it's in a lot of think tanks and positions of power in Washington and the government and in Congress who still are operating under this delusion that China, and Xi Jinping in particular, somehow wants to move them towards a market-based economy and will ultimately open up further. That's never been the case. It was a mistaken premise for 30 years, but especially for the last 10 years since Xi Jinping took power. He is clearly a Marxist-Leninist in the classic sense. He puts the party above all else, above the nation, above the government, certainly above the people. And he simply wants to harness some of the tools and instruments of markets to further the party's power and to cement its control over its own people and ultimately its ascendancy in the world.
Senator Cotton, thank you. And listen, until people remember that, they're never going to understand the China challenge. I appreciate your joining me, Senator Cotton. And I like to take credit for you saying about the Wuhan lab leak that first here, but I think maybe Maria Bartiromo beat me. I don't know. I have to go back and listen to the tapes, but I'm very glad you're still there and that you are vindicated again, even though Stephen Colbert will not admit it. Senator Tom Cotton, thank you.
And again, that was Hugh Hewitt with his guest, Senator Tom Cotton. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now for a little bit of recent news. I think it's basically happened over the weekend, but it's Scott Adams of the Dilbert cartoon writer. You need to use him as a negative example. Don't do what Scott Adams did. I feel sorry for Scott Adams because I think that he just fell into a couple of traps, into a couple of socialist traps. And if he had known better, he wouldn't have. He would have been able to handle the situation much better. So you can learn from his mistake. The two traps that he fell into is, number one, failing to understand that any poll, survey, or report only represents the people in the poll, survey, or report. But that's not the way they're reported. Today there was a poll, and it was reported as representing a majority of Americans. No, No. It only actually represents a majority of those surveyed. Usually that means about 2,000 people. So a majority of those means a little over 1,000 folks. That's a whole lot different than a majority of 365 million. Once you start thinking and listening to these polls and assuming that all Americans, half Americans, whatever, you're going to be easily intimidated. You're going to also be easily shaken up. The second mistake that Scott Adams made was not realizing that you have to separate the person or people from the politics. Okay, when you start talking about all white people this and all black people that, you're going after the people or persons and not the politics or, say, the politicians. One of the things that you would want to do is find out who sponsored this particular study. Was it maybe the NAACP? Then you turn around and you go after the NAACP. Then you recommend that people divest themselves of their investments in the NAACP, that they not donate to the NAACP, that kind of thing. You can do that. That works. That makes sense. That sounds reasonable and responsible. But to come out and say all white people should avoid all black people just sounds not just bigoted, but it sounds loony. It sounds Looney Tunes. And again, so you don't want to end up like Scott Adams and sounding Looney Tunes. The two things you need to remember, that polls and surveys only represent those people polled or surveyed. And number two, you have to separate the people from the politics. Back in a minute. Thank you. And this is Ron, your host, bidding all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there adios, and reminding you that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.